For roughly 300,000 years, human beings built cities, invented writing, domesticated animals, and created complex trade networks spanning entire continents, all without ever using a wheel. Let that sink in for a moment. The pyramids of Egypt were already under construction, using nothing but sledges, ramps, and raw human muscle, before anyone on the planet had figured out how to make an object roll. Massive stone blocks, some weighing many tons, were hauled across open desert by teams of laborers using little more than rope, timber, and coordinated brute force. A feat of organization and endurance that still leaves modern engineers impressed, all without a single wheel turning anywhere on the construction site. So here is the question that should genuinely puzzle you. If the wheel seems so obvious now, so simple that we hand the concept to toddlers as their very first toy, why did it take our species so incredibly long to invent it? And once someone finally did, why did it take even longer for that idea to become useful? The truth is stranger than you might expect. The wheel was not the first great insight. The axle was, and the gap between noticing that round things roll and actually building a working wheel and axle system may have taken thousands of years to cross, not because early humans were unintelligent, but because the engineering problem hiding inside a simple circle is far more complicated than it looks. To understand how strange this gap really is, you have to picture life before the wheel existed at all. For the vast majority of human history, if you needed to move something heavy, you had exactly 3 options: carry it, drag it, or make an animal carry or drag it for you. Heavy stones for construction were hauled using sledges, wooden platforms without wheels, dragged across the ground on log rollers or lubricated tracks of wet clay and mud. This method worked, in the sense that enormous stone monuments were successfully built using it, but it was punishingly slow, labor-intensive, and required enormous coordinated effort, sometimes involving hundreds or even thousands of workers pulling in unison. Rivers solved part of the transportation problem for early civilizations, which is exactly why so many of the earliest cities were built along major waterways. Boats could carry heavy cargo far more efficiently than land travel ever could without wheels. But rivers only go where rivers go. Anything that needed to move overland, away from water, still depended entirely on human backs, animal power, and dragging. Given how useful a wheel would obviously become, it is worth asking why nobody stumbled onto the idea earlier. After all, round objects like logs clearly roll. Humans had certainly noticed that. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because using a round log as a roller is not actually the same invention as a wheel, and the difference between the two ideas is enormous. If you place heavy objects on top of a series of round logs and push, the logs roll forward, the object moves, and then the logs end up behind the object, requiring someone to constantly pick them up and move them back to the front again. This method, sometimes theorized as an early transitional step toward wheeled transport, is inefficient, requires constant manual labor, and offers no way to steer or control direction. It is a clever trick, but it is not remotely the same as building a wheel that spins freely on a fixed axle attached to a vehicle. The true breakthrough was never simply the idea that round things roll. The true breakthrough was the axle, a fixed rod around which a wheel could rotate independently, allowing a cart or platform to move smoothly forward while the wheels did all the rolling work beneath it, without anyone needing to place, retrieve, and replace anything. That single engineering insight, seemingly small, is what actually separates a pile of logs from a functioning vehicle. So when does the archaeological evidence actually show this breakthrough happening? The earliest confirmed wheel discovered by archaeologists comes from the Ljubljana marshes in present-day Slovenia. A wooden wheel with a wooden axle dated to approximately 3130 BC, remarkably well preserved thanks to the oxygen-poor, waterlogged conditions of the marsh that slowed decay for thousands of years. This wheel was not simply a solid disc cut from a tree trunk, which might sound like the obvious first step. It was constructed from 2 carefully shaped wooden boards joined together, evidence of deliberate craftsmanship rather than a crude accident. At roughly the same period, archaeological and artistic evidence from Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Also points toward early wheeled technology emerging independently or in parallel. Some of the clearest early evidence comes not from an actual surviving wheel, but from artwork, pictographic symbols, and carved images depicting sledges mounted on wheels, along with the famous standard of an ornately decorated box unearthed in a royal tomb, illustrating four-wheeled carts pulled by animals in a battle procession dated to roughly 2600 BC. Because wood decays easily and few early wheels have survived intact, archaeologists remain genuinely uncertain about exactly where the wheel was first invented, whether it emerged once and spread outward, or whether the idea arose independently in more than one region around the same general time period. Many researchers now lean toward the theory that the wheel likely first appeared not as a tool for transportation at all, but as a tool for pottery. The potter's wheel, a rotating platform used to shape clay into pots and vessels, appears in the archaeological record slightly earlier than wheeled vehicles, and some historians theorize that this device may have provided the conceptual foundation. The fixed pivot point rotating smoothly beneath a working surface that later inspired the idea of applying the same rotating mechanism to transportation. If this theory holds, it would mean the wheel was invented first to shape mud, and only afterward repurposed to move it. Whatever the precise sequence of events, once the wheel and axle combination appeared, it triggered a wave of transformation that reshaped nearly every aspect of ancient life within a remarkably short span of time. Early wheeled carts allowed farmers to move significantly larger loads of grain, produce, and building materials across greater distances with far less physical exhaustion, freeing up labor that had previously been consumed entirely by manual transport. Heavier crop yields could now reach marketplaces and storage facilities that would have been impractical to reach by foot alone, allowing agricultural surplus to accumulate more efficiently and supporting the growth of larger, denser population centers. Trade networks expanded dramatically as well. Goods that once had to be carried on human backs or on the backs of pack animals across difficult overland routes could now be loaded onto wheeled carts, hauled by oxen or donkeys, moving greater volumes over longer distances with a fraction of the previous effort. This directly fueled the growth of long-distance trade routes connecting distant settlements, exchanging not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices between civilizations that might otherwise have remained isolated from one another. Warfare transformed just as dramatically. Wheeled chariots, appearing later in the archaeological record with technological refinements including spoked wheels rather than solid wooden discs, granted armies a speed and mobility advantage that reshaped ancient military strategy entirely. A chariot could outmaneuver infantry, deliver archers rapidly across a battlefield, and strike with a combination of speed and force that infantry alone could never replicate. Some historians, including researchers such as David Anthony, who has extensively studied the connections between early wheeled vehicles, domesticated horses, and the spread of ancient languages across Eurasia, argue that the combination of wheels and horsepower may have driven some of the largest cultural and demographic migrations in ancient human history. As mobile groups spread their technology, language, and influence across vast distances of the Eurasian steppe. Engineering itself advanced dramatically because of the wheel. Early solid wooden wheels were heavy and prone to cracking under stress. Over centuries, craftsmen refined the design, developing spoked wheels that were significantly lighter while maintaining structural strength, distributing weight more efficiently around a central hub. This refinement required increasingly sophisticated woodworking techniques and a growing understanding of tension, weight distribution, and material strength, principles that would later influence architecture, construction, and mechanical engineering far beyond transportation alone. The wheel also transformed water management and construction through devices like the water wheel, which appeared later and applied the same rotational principle to an entirely different purpose, lifting water for irrigation or powering early mechanical devices. Similarly, gears, pulleys, and other rotational mechanisms that would eventually underpin much of mechanical engineering all trace their conceptual lineage back to that same fundamental insight, a rigid object rotating smoothly around a fixed point. The refinement from solid wood to spoked construction deserves a closer look, because it illustrates just how much trial, error, and accumulated craftsmanship stood between the earliest crude wheel and the elegant machines that eventually rolled across battlefields and trade roads. A solid wooden wheel, cut or assembled from thick planks, is heavy, and that weight becomes a serious liability once you try to attach it to a fast-moving vehicle pulled by animals. Early wheelwrights, the specialized craftsmen who devoted their working lives to solving exactly this problem, gradually discovered that removing material from the center of a solid wheel and replacing it with a small number of thin wooden spokes radiating outward from a central hub could preserve most of the wheel's strength while dramatically reducing its overall weight. This was not an overnight discovery. It required generations of experimentation with different types of wood, different spoke counts, different methods of fitting a wheel's outer rim tightly enough to withstand the repeated shock of rough terrain without splitting apart. The result, once perfected, was a wheel that could turn faster, carry a chariot at far greater speed, and survive far more punishment than anything possible with the earlier solid disc design. Different regions of the ancient world also seem to have refined and adopted the wheel along noticeably different timelines. Another detail that supports the theory of either multiple independent origins or, at minimum, several separate waves of adoption rather than one single. Tidy invention spreading uniformly outward like ripples in a pond. Evidence from ancient China points toward wheeled vehicles appearing there by roughly the 2nd millennium BCC, developing distinctive design features suited to local materials, terrain, and military needs, including their own eventual refinements to spoked wheeled chariot technology used extensively in warfare and ceremonial processions. Meanwhile, across large portions of sub-Saharan Africa, wheeled transportation historically saw far more limited practical use, a pattern researchers generally attribute to a combination of dense forest terrain poorly suited to wheeled traffic, the prevalence of set's flies that made sustaining large draft animals difficult across significant portions of the continent, and well-developed alternative transportation networks, including extensive river systems and highly effective human portage traditions that made wheeled carts comparatively less advantageous in many regions. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange and specific the historical distribution of the wheel actually turned out to be. Remarkably, several major civilizations across the ancient world, including sophisticated societies in the Americas, never developed practical wheeled transportation despite possessing advanced engineering, architecture, and mathematical knowledge. Archaeological evidence shows that small wheeled toys existed in parts of Mesoamerica, suggesting that the basic concept of a rolling wheel was understood. However, the absence of large domesticated draft animals capable of pulling heavy wheeled vehicles across the difficult terrain common throughout much of the region likely limited any practical incentive to develop the wheel further for transportation purposes. This detail matters enormously, because it reveals that the wheel's usefulness was never automatic or guaranteed. Its transformative power depended heavily on a surrounding ecosystem of complementary conditions, suitable terrain, domesticated animals strong enough to pull heavy loads, and practical need, all converging together. This helps explain why the wheel's story is not simply the tale of one clever idea, but the story of an idea meeting the right conditions at the right moment in history. Once those conditions aligned across Europe and Asia, the wheel's spread accelerated rapidly. Evidence of wheeled vehicles appears across a surprisingly wide geographic area within just a few centuries of the earliest confirmed examples, suggesting that the underlying concept, once demonstrated successfully in one location, spread through trade contact, cultural exchange, and simple imitation far more quickly than the initial invention itself had taken to develop. By the time large empires began rising across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Rome, wheeled transportation had become so deeply embedded into daily life that entire road networks were constructed specifically to accommodate wheeled traffic, complete with standardized cart widths that determined road dimensions for centuries afterward. An engineering legacy so enduring that some historians trace faint echoes of ancient wheel spacing conventions into much later transportation systems, including early railway gauges, centuries and even millennia later. Beyond roads, trade, and warfare, the same rotating principle quietly reshaped ordinary domestic life in ways easy to overlook today. Grinding grain into flour, once an exhausting task performed entirely by hand using stone tools, was gradually transformed by rotating millstones, an application of the same wheel and axle logic turned sideways and put to work crushing rather than carrying. Water-powered mills, appearing in various forms across different ancient civilizations, harnessed flowing rivers to turn heavy millstones automatically, freeing enormous amounts of human labor that had previously been devoted to the slow, repetitive grinding of grain by hand. Construction technology advanced as well, as simple rotating pulley systems, again relying on the same rotational principle, allowed builders to lift heavy stones and materials with far less brute human effort than earlier construction methods had required, gradually enabling more ambitious architectural projects across successive generations of builders who inherited and refined these mechanical principles. Consider, for a moment, everything that followed from that single insight: a rigid wheel spinning freely around a fixed axle. Modern transportation, from bicycles to automobiles to aircraft landing gear, still relies on that same basic rotational principle first solved in wood and stone thousands of years ago. Industrial machinery, powered by rotating gears and shafts, traces its lineage directly back to the same conceptual breakthrough. Even the exploration of other worlds depends on it, as wheeled rovers currently roll across the dusty alien surface of Mars, still relying on the exact same fundamental mechanical principle first achieved by ancient craftsmen working with wood and mud beside a marsh in what is now Slovenia, thousands of years before anyone could have imagined where that idea might eventually travel. It took our species roughly 300,000 years to solve a problem that now seems almost too simple to explain to a child. And yet, once solved, it took only a few thousand years for that single rotating circle to carry humanity from dragging stone across open ground to rolling machines across the surface of another planet entirely. The wheel did not just move objects from one place to another. It moved civilization itself forward, one slow, deliberate rotation at a time.